And there is a practice in classical Jewish education, and back in the day, or in the cheder system, that they would start teaching Vayikra. They wouldn't start with Bereshit. They would start with Vayikra. They would start with the sacrifices, and a number of explanations have been given. One is that, like Rashi asks very famously on the opening verse of the Torah, there's a midrashic question: why should the Torah start with Bereshit? It should start with Hachodesh Hazeh Lachem. The Torah should start with the laws. And the sense was, in teaching young Jewish children about Torah, about God, go with the laws, and not just any laws. Don't talk about daily laws. Talk about the more esoteric laws, to lay the groundwork that Judaism and Halacha are without explanation, not always meant to be relevant. It's like dropping them into the deep end of the pool. So that was the idea of Vayikra. I heard an educational explanation, a more modern one from a colleague, that when you look at the sacrifices, you have to use your imagination a little bit, and we think of them through whatever prism we've encountered them, whether it be the Parsha of the week, or whether it be our study of Mishnah or Talmud or Jewish history, and we may have a certain picture, but in some ways it's very out there. It's very it's very fanciful. It's very colorful. It's very strange. It captures the imagination. Think of the success of some of the literary in the literary field, the books that kids like most. The example this educator gave, the Harry Potter phenomenon. Right? It's not real. It's not every day. It's wonder. It's imagination. It's things that you don't see in real life, but maybe it pushes the limits of what's possible and the like. And so, sacrifices have that element too. They don't really make much sense. They're not about, at least in the modern sensibility, it's about animals and blood and fire and smoke and wine and flour. It's all types of things mixed together. So, with that as an introduction, just wanted to share an image. We're coming up on Pesach, and the Pesach sacrifice is one that is on a lot of people's minds. So this is the image of the reenactment of bringing the Korban Pesach, right? It's a whole sheep. It has a wooden spit all the way through it, because that's how it was barbecued, not with a metal spit, but with a wooden spit. There's a whole technical reason why. And every year, there is a reenactment of the Korban Pesach. Recently, that reenactment has involved what's called the Third Temple Institute, which is an institute devoted to studying the laws of the Beit HaMikdash, and to also come up with blueprints on how to construct a third Beit HaMikdash. They've already built some of the vessels that will be part of it, trying to assemble the clothes that would be worn by the Kohanim and the Leviim. And when they perform this ritual, they put some of those things into service, and they specifically have a Kohen be the one to slaughter the lamb and to collect the blood in the silver vessels and the like. And so it's this time of year that those types of ceremonies take place. Is this why is this why the barbecue is such a popular experience in Israel? Yom HaSukkot, that's what everybody does. Maybe, maybe not. But there is this idea that the sacrifices are meant to be something not just read about and studied, but also to try and restore. There's also every year a headline of one of the more far right-wing activists who gets arrested by bringing a lamb onto the Temple Mount. It's kind of a custom between him and the security authorities already. They know that he's going to come, because he doesn't want to just offer the Pesach sacrifice. He wants to bring it on the Temple Mount. So in exploring how we look at sacrifices today, I wanted to sketch out a little bit an overview of how sacrifices, as presented in the book of Vayikra, were understood, some trends in how they're understood, talk a little bit about whether or not sacrifices can, should, or intended to be brought today, even without a temple, as well as this idea that have sacrifices outlived their usefulness, and are they destined to return? And then maybe close with a little bit of an analysis that maybe sacrifices aren't really so far removed from providing the type of lesson that they seem to have been intended in the first place. So I hope I didn't scare anybody with the roasting lamb image, and let's get underway. So the word sacrifice, korban, has within it the Hebrew root of karov, draw near. And everyone feels that there's an opportunity of drawing near to God. The sacrifice is a kind of conduit. Where there's a major dispute is between the Rambam and the Ramban, between Maimonides and Nachmanides, as to the purpose. Are sacrifices a means to an end, or is the bringing of a sacrifice the purpose itself? Is it the end itself? So Maimonides very famously explains, he mentions this in his guide to the perplexed in the third section, that the idea of the sacrifice is to focus the Jewish nation on God. However, how were people doing it back then? All religions were worshiping their gods with sacrifices. Everyone knew how do you get close to God, whether it be the Egyptian god or the Canaanite god, you get close to God through sacrifice. And so what Hashem did was command the Jewish people to bring sacrifices, but to bring sacrifices to God, kind of purifying the practice so that it's no longer a pagan form of worship. Now it becomes Jewish form of worship. And therefore, the goal was to create a sense of closeness between the people and God through the medium of worship. Take the medium of worship that everyone's familiar with, sacrifices, and then ultimately, this is how we'll develop that type of a relationship. And for Maimonides, the sacrifice are a means to an end. It's a way to get the Jewish people focused on serving God. Once they're focused on serving God, it would stand to reason maybe you don't need sacrifices the same way. And we'll talk about how that is understood in a moment. But this was Maimonides' approach. Now, Maimonides is criticized harshly for this approach. Nachmanides calls them divrei havai, empty words. It is a tremendous mistake, he says, for Rambam to say this. And therefore, it's important to note the Rambam didn't take this just philosophically. People think, the Rambam is more modern thinking and, wouldn't appreciate the messiness of animal sacrifice and getting close to God. They try to understand it that way. But the Rambam is very similar to a midrash that's found in Vayikra, that the purpose of sacrifices, and this is a midrash, Vayikra Rabbah, that God said, let them bring sacrifices before me so that their sacrifices will separate them from idol worship and they will be redeemed. Right? There is this idea that having sacrificial worship, having a sacrificial service, that's how we're going to get away from idol worship. We need, we have a different focus. So the Rambam takes this very strongly as, understanding it within the context of what other nations were doing at the time. And the goal is to wean the Jewish people away and give them a familiar mechanism for getting close to God. And that is the purpose of sacrifices. And there could be that he is echoing or amplifying a rabbinic tradition on this subject. That's the Rambam. Ramban, as I mentioned, was very, very bothered by this interpretation. He didn't want to see sacrifices as a means to an end. He wanted to see them as the end itself. And therefore, he focuses on the idea of karov, a sacrifice as an effort to get close to God by the very act of the sacrifice. Whether it be, for example, as a sin offering, a person who commits a sin, really, they should die for their sin. But instead of a person dying, God provided the opportunity that the animal is in place of the person. Or, as the Nachmanides says, the activity surrounding the sacrifice really engages the person into doing things for God. It's not just saying things or feeling things. It involves carrying things. It involves moving things. The sacrificial service involves slaughter and sprinkling and fire. It involves the opportunity with some sacrifices, the Kohanim eat, with others, the people eat. So there's a certain communal element, there's a certain opportunity afterwards to gather together and to analyze what happened or to celebrate what happened. There's a whole mechanism here. There's a whole parsha of sacrificial service that's taking place here, meant to involve the mind, the body, the soul, and provides an opportunity for a person really to think about their relationship with God, what has gone wrong, what can go better, what has gone right, and the like. And this is the way Nachmanides understands it. Yes, it's about getting close to God, but it's the sacrificial service itself which provides that opportunity. We're missing something when we don't have that opportunity to bring the sacrifices themselves. Questions, comments, reactions to these two approaches for the sacrificial service?
Rabbi, I have a question.
Sure.
To the best of your knowledge, do conservative and reform movements, I'm sorry to mention the name in vain, but do they have a different slant on the whole concept of sacrifice than the Orthodox tradition?
Well, historically, they may recognize it the same way. It's just whether there's contemporary relevance. So, for example, Reform movement doesn't believe in sacrifices will ever come back or have any relevance, and they've taken out the Musaf service. Reform in general has taken away the forward-thinking, redemptive elements of Judaism. So that Reform service doesn't have Musaf, because Musaf that we say on Shabbos and holidays is really about invoking the sacrificial system. Conservative Judaism, as is always the case in conservative movement, is more complicated, right? Because conservative Judaism, the easy thing about Reform is that they're inspired by Sinai and Torah, but they're not bound by regulation in Jewish law, right? Reform Judaism is very much to choose whether or not to be bound by commandments. I always like to tell the story so I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut, and I was also a student rabbi at the Yale Hillel, and the Hillel director there was a rabbi who'd been there for a number of years, and he wore a kippah, and he kept Shabbos and kosher, and his wife was on the board of the mikvah, and people were very surprised to hear that he was a Reform rabbi. So someone said to him, Rabbi, you do all these religious things and your wife is observant everything, so if you're a Reform rabbi, what gives? He's like, well, Reform Judaism says you can choose to practice the way you want to practice, and I want to practice Orthodox. So that was how he approached it. So Reform clearly, it moves away from sacrifices. Conservative has a harder time because they're bound by tradition. So they don't necessarily grapple the same way with whether sacrifices have to come back or not. But I think that they certainly have they have the responsibility to grapple with the subject, even if they decide to try and gloss over it. Phyllis, you have your hand up.
Yes, I'm referring to last night's lecture, and this description of the sacrifice of the community coming together reminds me of Rabbi Sacks's idea of I forgot what they called it, but the community, the third model, the community having a joint project to build a community. And that's, what it reminded me of.
Right. The Ramban talks about, the fact that you have to use your arms and your legs, and there's a whole procedure. Judaism is meant to be a full body experience. And so those activities, whether performed by the individual, family, or community, definitely have a strong place, have a entrenched place in Jewish practice. And Ramban wanted that to be the explanation of the sacrifice, and not to look at it as just a means to the end game of connecting to God, as important as that is. And look, some would say that we can appreciate Maimonides not necessarily focusing on an intrinsic offering of sacrifices, right? Maimonides lived a long time after sacrifices had been brought. Maimonides was far removed from, and we're even further removed from sacrificial service, right? We say at the end of the Shemona Esrei, we take 3 steps back and we, rebuild the temple. Give us a share in your Torah. And there we will serve you the way we did.
This is Father you, pal. I'm on a Zoom. Thank you.
We pray for that, that the service of old will be once again acceptable and appreciated by God as in days gone by. So, every single day we're talking about bringing sacrifices again. And this one estimate, we're not paying as much attention, but what is its role? Is it meant to be something that was a springboard for a relationship with God that we don't necessarily have to revisit? Or is it something that's meant to be revisited in a very real way, because it's the entire totality of the sacrificial service which sheds light upon and can inspire and inform our connection to God? It's important to note that even though the Rambam sees this as a kind of means to an end, and it's about getting close to God, he very strongly states that it's important for people to study the sacrificial laws. And he says one should not say that there is no reason, there's no necessity to study sacrifices today because we no longer bring them, the way many people say. So Maimonides recognizes that many people say sacrifices don't matter, you don't have to study them anymore because we don't bring them. And some would say Maimonides would agree with that because we've moved beyond sacrifices. But Maimonides himself states that that's not the case. He could be saying this for a whole host of reasons, one of which is that it's Torah and you have to study it. But it could be that while he sees them as a means to an end, there is an agreement that it's important to continue studying and appreciating the totality of the service. What about contemporary day sacrifices? Is it that something that can be explored or can be attempted? Is it something that requires a temple? The Talmud mentions in the Mishnah that Rabbi Yoshua stated that he heard that they were bringing sacrifices even without a temple. Right. So remember, the Mishnah is being edited around the year 200. So over 100 years after the destruction of the temple, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi included the teaching that sacrifices may still have been brought. In that the idea that maybe you don't need a temple for sacrifices. Maybe the fact that we had a temple or we had a place where sacrifices were brought, sacrifices can continue to be brought in that place. And therefore, there's still contemporary relevance. Maimonides actually agrees with this principle. He agrees with that Mishnah, and in his law code, he states that it is something that's technically permissible, that once we've had a temple, we can certainly bring sacrifices in that place, even if the temple doesn't stand. The reality remains, however, that it's gotten complicated because For much of Jewish history, of the last 2,000 years, Jews couldn't go there. And even in more recent history, when Jews have access, and Har Habayit Biyadenu was a declaration in the Six-Day War, it's still not a place where it's easily accessed to bring sacrifices. And we begin also to encounter some of the questions of can a Jew ascend the Temple Mount, leaving aside the political or Israeli civil regulations? From a halachic perspective, is it permissible or not? As with many of the great issues of the day, there's a machloket. The chief rabbinate says that you can't. A growing number of rabbis are suggesting that one can. Tours up to the Temple Mount are becoming more common and more frequent. People are going up there. We always, of course, the idea that there's a kind of status quo on the Temple Mount, that Israel provides the security, but religious regulations are determined by the Waqf, by the Islamic religious authorities, and Jews can't worship there, and they can't even move their lips there. It's a larger discussion. But it does seem that there's the theoretical halachic possibility of bringing sacrifices. In a sense, they're not meant to, it's not meant to disappear. And they're still very much a relevant imperative to go and bring them. The flip side of this is that some teachings have seemed to emerge that sacrifices won't exist in the future. There is a midrash it's a midrash Tehillim, which quotes a teaching that says that in the future, there will be no prayers other than the Thanksgiving prayer, and there will be no sacrifices other than the Thanksgiving sacrifice. So there's a midrash which entertains the possibility of fewer sacrifices in the future, which turns into a discussion that some sacrifices won't renew in the future. How are we supposed to understand this? Well, we'll have to wait to the future to get a fuller understanding. But Rabbi David Avudraham, who talking in the 15th century, explains this idea that think about what much of prayer is about. Much of prayer is about asking for things or trying to correct mistakes or asking God to forgive us. Our hope is in the future we'll have everything we need and we won't make so many mistakes. So the only prayer left is giving thanks. What about the sacrifices? The sacrifices too, we're trying to achieve a certain level of closeness or repair the relationship with God. In a messianic era where things are more greatly improved, we won't have those sin offerings or need to repair the relationship. So the only sacrifice that will be left is to give thanks to God. And so he understands this, not that there will quantitatively be fewer sacrifices and sacrifices might disappear in the future. No, sacrifices will fully appear in the future. It's just that the likelihood is the existing conditions, especially on a religious, spiritual level, won't require the same types of prayers and sacrifices, and therefore they will be more limited. And Maimonides says very clearly in his Laws of Kings that ultimately when Mashiach comes, he will build the temple, gather the exiles, restore a system of Torah law, and they will bring sacrifices. Does he mean all of them or just the Thanksgiving one? We're not so sure. But those who want to say that, Maimonides' view was, that it's a means to an end would seem to indicate the possibility of no sacrifices in the future. Maimonides never says that, and in fact, the only thing he explicitly says is the opposite. But we do have this idea that, obviously in the future, our need for them from a spiritual religious perspective, as Avudraham points out, may change. And clearly those activists who like to bring a sacrifice today have a legal standing to build upon. However, it's the challenging politics and even the halachics of going up to the Temple Mount that certainly get in the way. Questions, comments, reactions on the way we look at sacrifices, the legacy of sacrifices today?
Rabbi,
Yeah.
we say that the Torah adjusts to modernity. I believe that every Erev Yom Kippur when we shlik kaparas, that's a form of sacrifice. Why do we have to shech the chicken when we could give money instead?
Right.
So,
Well, great question. And kaparis in particular, I think it highlights the tension between doing it the way it's always been done versus what's the meaning of the ritual. Right. Kaparis was meant to be on Erev Yom Kippur, everyone's got to eat. Poor people don't have food. Here's a chicken, I'm giving it to a poor person. But that's what it really was about. And that meant that so I'm basically buying a chicken, either getting it slaughtered or giving it to a poor person to have them slaughter it. That's kaparas. Now, as time went on, fewer people were slaughtering the chickens, fewer people were taking the chickens that day. Right nowadays, if someone needs food in Erev Yom Kippur, giving them a chicken is not really going to help as much because you got to get it shechted and you got to kosher it, and who knows how to do that kind of stuff anymore. So it turned into this idea of it's really about the tzedakah, like you say. However, it started with regards to the chickens. It has to continue. So instead of it being about the direct support of the person in need, it turned into loud trucks full of chickens, making a lot of noise in Borough Park, and people going there and becoming more about the ritual of the shlug, as they call it, than about the goal of the charity. And of course, when people do that, they give money to the person who has the chicken for them. The tzedakah remains, but it's moved farther away from the intent. However, people are still connected to the way it was done, the ritual itself. In a sense, it's a little bit like how we understand the sacrifice. Is it about the end result of our religious experience, or are we tethered to the fact that there needs to be a sacrifice? And I think that it's probably natural for the modern Jew to have less nostalgia for the sacrifice. At the same time, we lose something when we completely untether ourselves from the ritual that was used to accomplish this. But in addition, Judy, the idea of kaparas is all fraught with, what is this idea that we're taking our sins and putting them on the chicken and killing? There's a whole, there's a kind of like a voodoo component to it that is criticized by some of the halachic authorities in the Code of Jewish Law, but they're not able to stop it because it was just too entrenched in the Jewish practice and the Jewish consciousness to do so. And it very much probably emerges from that, we're able to do this because we do sacrifices. So we used to sacrifice X, Y, and Z, and now we got this chicken thing.
I would just picture in my mind what kind of opposition the Humane Society might give the Jews if they saw this.
Oh, they are. There have been lawsuits and city ordinances. It's an ongoing issue. I think in 2019 they had gotten a court order to stop it, and it was being appealed. And I think with COVID and everything, there's a lot less of a spotlight on it because it's not happening as much frequency. But don't worry, they're after us.
Yeah, I know. Thank
Phyllis. Yeah.
Yes, it just seems to me, Shlugging Kaporas seems to me the antithesis of Jewish law, which stresses a humaneness in killing animals. And that's, when they want to, when Peter wants to do away with, ritual slaughter, and we say, well, this is the quickest way to kill an animal, a swift cut with a sharp blade. And then you have this Shlugging Kaporas. I can't reconcile it. I really can't.
Okay. Look, I think I mentioned this when I taught about kosher a couple of weeks, months, I don't know, I lose track of time. But the idea of humane slaughter, or shechita being the most humane way to kill, I don't think the cow agrees. If I think it was up to the cow, the cow would still like to be alive. But I think that there is certainly the concern. We believe that tsar balei chayim, that we're not supposed to, for no reason, cause wanton pain to any living creature. What's happened contemporary kaparas has become messy, and it wasn't only cruelty to animals. With such rapid slaughter taking place of so many animals, there was concern about the the kashrut of the slaughtering. Remember, the laws of slaughter require that a certain blade be used and the blade be a certain way. And like any blade, the more you use it, the duller it gets and the more attention it needs. And if you're slaughtering all these chickens, what happens to the knife? If the knife gets nicked and the slaughter is no good, and you give the chicken anyway, you have all sorts of religious complications. And so it's moved away from, as was described, away to, a chicken in every pot for Yom Kippur or Erev Yom Kippur turned into something that moved farther away from it. Yet, in many circles, it's as popular as ever because of the fact that it's a ritual and we keep doing the rituals the way we've always done them. So what about drawing some contemporary lesson or messaging from the sacrifices, right? On some level, we're not bringing sacrifices, right? We're not in the temple. We're not in Jerusalem. We don't have access to the Temple Mount. I don't know if we have too many radical activists among us who are going to try to get in there on Erev Pesach. We can appreciate conceptually the Nachmanidean view that the engagement with the process and the activity of the sacrifices is helpful in our connecting to God. The same way any family or community activity strengthens our appreciation for God. But we're not doing those specific activities. What legacy might the sacrifices have, the individual ones? And so recently I read an article from Rabbi Mark Angel, who was describing this, the idea of what the sacrifices, what are some of the values that are found in the sacrifices? And maybe a good place to start is, what are the different sacrifices? And what might those different sacrifices tell us about some lessons about our relationships or our behavior? So one of the sacrifices is the olah. The olah is the completely burnt offering. And this is a sacrifice that all went to God, nothing remained, there's no eating of it afterwards. So from the word olah, which means to go up, there's a certain, one of the lessons of the sacrifice, the bringing of a sacrifice, the participation in the sacrifice, the idea behind it, when we can't do the action, is moving upward. The idea of striving to be better. The striving not only to be better, but sometimes there's sacrifice involved in being better. There's a certain idealism that is required to draw close to God and fulfill our religious mission. So the olah sacrifice has a certain message for our religious behavior, our behavior in general. An olah sacrifice, which is completely burnt, the burnt offering reminds us of the need to strive higher, without any expectation of reward, just like the sacrifice is completely burnt up. There's a certain idealism that goes into spiritual and religious accomplishment. So that's the idea behind looking at the sacrifices and maybe picking up some keys to individual behavior or betterment to learn from them. So that's the olah. Let's do another one. There's the shlamim, the peace offering. Anyone want to venture a suggestion? What is the behavioral lesson or the moral being taught from the peace offering? So peace is something that's of a religious ideal. It's not just, we want peace and quiet, but it's something to pursue and something to celebrate and something to sanctify. One of the peace offerings was the Thanksgiving offering, right? The Thanksgiving offering is kind of very straightforward. We talked a little bit about it in the fact that it's a constant, that there's always a Thanksgiving, there's always gratitude. So the peace offering, which was a sacrifice that the person who brought it was then able to take some of the food and share it with other people. It's the idea of sanctifying the relationship. The idea of sanctifying the table, the people around the table coming together. There's that element as well. All right, let's move on to the sin offering. Right, so the sin offering very much is about correcting mistakes. But the sin offering in particular was brought when mistakes were committed accidentally. And so what are we learning from the sin offering? So, mistakes happen, that's true, but you also have to admit the mistakes. The mistakes are part of admitting the mistakes or owning the mistakes, and even bringing a sacrifice about the mistakes. All of these are part of the road to getting better. It's not just paper over them, make excuses for them. It's own the mistakes in order to transcend them. It's a lot of good Yom Kippur Torah, which I'm sure we'll come back to in the fall. So in addition to the sin offering, you have the guilt offering, the Karban Asham. And one of the guilt offerings were brought by those who accidentally caused a loss to the temple. For example, if the temple had property that someone accidentally borrowed or used, they had to bring a guilt offering. So what specifically are we learning from the guilt offering for mistakenly using an item that belonged to the temple? Well, maybe it should give us an appreciation for that which is holy. As a pulpit rabbi, I would say it gives us an appreciation to treat shul as a more sacred place and not talk in shul, maybe. But certainly the idea of this type of guilt offering in particular, which is brought for a particular sin of sinning against the sanctuary, is to have a better appreciation for the sacred, the religiously sacred spaces that we encounter. There was another asham, there was another guilt offering, and that was for the breach of trust for those who dealt dishonestly with others. As to do with someone that swore falsely in a court case or gave false testimony. Here, this is a reminder of the power of honesty and the need to be honest, and that our word is our bond. Also, the idea that if we're dishonest amongst our fellow human being, that's also a sin against God. And how honesty, as they say, is not only the best policy, but it's a religious obligation and responsibility. And when we violate that, when we breach that confidence or break that covenant of trust, we need to acknowledge and repair that misdeed. And the idea, these are some of the ideas that these are sacrifices which had, they were meant to bring us closer to God. Bringing them was a religious activity, but they also represent certain character traits and certain types of behavior that we can learn from, that when we see that sacrifices were brought for these mistakes, they remind us of how these character traits are ones we should work on to improve ourselves, to improve, our surroundings or our circle. And so these are very readily acknowledged values of honesty and trust and community and striving for excellence. These are all things which we value in our everyday lives, but they're also lessons from the sacrifices. And even if we're not bringing them anymore, the lessons of their values are certainly always relevant. Whether we'll be bringing sacrifices again, we'll just have to wait and see.